I don't think so, faltered Jamie. It's just that the little dog disappeared, and there was a caterpillar instead. I knew the caterpillar must really be Spook, so I picked him up to keep him from Grimalda. And as soon as I touched him, he was the little dog again. As soon as I touched him, he seemed to change. The head witch received this explanation in silence, her gaze shuttling thoughtfully from Jamie to Grimalda. She said at length. As soon as you touched him, eh? Your power lies in your touch, then. She leered disagreeably at Grimalda. The touch of love is what he possesses, my girl. This puts another light on the matter. She heaved herself up in a flutter of black draperies that took a few tottering steps back and forth. The problem we have now is how to deal with the boy. If we were an ordinary boy, it would be customary to dump him into the brew. Not directly, of course. First, he should be softened by simmering in a glue for an hour or so. Her long nose twitched at the fumes from the bubbling kettle, and she smacked her lips with pleasure before going on. If, on the other hand, he is a magician and can match Grimalda's powers, he might make some claim to this familiar after all. She pushed thoughtfully at her lips with a bony finger, and I should hardly like to simmer a magician, even for an hour. The other witches had been listening to her in breathless attention, and one of them spoke out shrilly. What about a contest, ma'am? Can we have a contest to see who shall have the familiar? That's it, shrieked the head witch. A contest! What a splendid idea! The boy, or magician, against Grimalda. She sat down abruptly on the pile of rocks. I'll be the judge. I'll make up the rules. Fair means or foul, both are equally good, and the familiar will be awarded to the winner. Does that mean that if I win, I can keep him? Asked Jamie boldly. Right, beamed the head witch. But how do I get him home with me? Jamie persisted. Transportation provided, boomed the head witch handsomely. And if I lose? Jamie asked in a low voice. Then it's off with Grimalda, that familiar must go, and into the brew with you. Now don't interrupt, we must see to the scoring. She beckoned to one of the crows, who flew cawing to her feet. Leaning over, the head witch drew 2 circles in the loose dirt with her fingers, one before Grimalda and one in front of Jamie. Whichever side scores, drop a stone into the circle belonging to it, she told the crow, indicating with a sweep of her hand the pebbles that lay scattered near the pile of rocks. The crow nodded and began pacing solemnly back and forth between the 2 circles, ready to carry out its duties. Now then, said the head witch, Grimalda must use her powers upon the familiar, and the boy, or magician, must try to prevent her with his. The first side to score 2 times out of 3 is the winner. You may begin. Grimalda stood very still for a moment, staring with narrowed eyes at Jamie and Spook. Then she brought her hands up and together and made a lightning thrust at Spook. At once he began to have the feeling that he was no longer himself. His body seemed to be dividing into 2 parts, with a hard covering like a shell encasing it. In addition to his own 4 legs, 4 more shot out of his sides, and they all began to grow long and pencil thin, and to be covered with little pads of hair. He squinted as he waved one of them in front of him, trying to make out what kind of creature it had become, for although he had now found he had 8 eyes, none of them saw very well. Am I a crab, he wondered? Or a bug? Or maybe a spider? That's what I am. I'm a spider. He tried to see Jamie's face, but at first he was too short-sighted, and then to his horror, he commenced to grow, larger and larger and taller on his very long, hairy legs. He shot past Jamie's frightened face and went on growing until the row of gaping witches looked like dolls below him. When he stopped at last, he was an enormous spider on 8 gigantic legs with 2 fangs curved like buffalo horns and 8 eyes as big as soup plates. That's a terrifyingly large spider. Reminds me of Shelob. Peering down, he discovered the tiny figure of Jamie backing frantically away from him. Oh no, he begged silently, for he had no voice. What shall I do? Oh, what can I do? Jamie was backing away from the row of witches towards the woodland when Spook, remembering he was a spider, began desperately to spin. Working his spinnerets as fast as he could, he sent a long, shimmering streamer of silk after Jamie, who had broken into a run now, and was stumbling in his haste to take cover in the woods. The streamer caught him deftly about the waist and held him gently where he was. Then, very slowly, and very carefully, Spook closed the joints of his giant legs and folded them beneath him so that he was flat on the ground in front of the little boy. He bowed his terrible head so that Jamie could no longer see it. "Don't be afraid. Oh, don't be afraid," he implored in his heart. I don't know about you, but I would be afraid of a spider like that. That thing is terrifying. And it's huge. As he waited, not daring to look, he felt Jamie move against the silken tether. He heard one footstep, and then another, shuffle towards him. Another dreadful pause, and very slightly, just barely, he felt the tips of Jamie's fingers tap his horny back. "Spook?" Jamie's voice quivered. "Spook?" Before he could draw his breath in relief, Spook was restored to his own size and shape by Jamie's touch. Jamie stared at Spook, and then his face broke into a big grin. "Come on," he said, and they raced back to the waiting witches. "The boy has scored! Give the boy a stone," the head witch called. The crow bustled up with a stone in its beak, and as it passed Grimalda, she stuck out her foot and neatly tripped the big black bird, popping the stone from its beak. With a furious squawk at Grimalda, it recovered the stone and finished its errand on the wing. It's kind of a sore loser. Grimalda scowled and brought up her hands to make another gesture at Spook. He felt himself changing again, shrinking this time, shriveling, melting. He was very warm and growing warmer. Warmer and smaller, much smaller. Heat spread all through him until he glowed and pulsed with it, and he thought it must be eating him up. "What can I be?" he thought. "Whatever I am, if Jamie touches me, I will surely burn him." He could hear the witches catch their breath in a long "ah" as Jamie put out his hand. "Clever Grimilda, cunning Grimilda," they chanted. "She's changed the familiar into a live coal! A live coal!" Jamie's hand reached out, nearer and nearer, but then he drew it back hastily. The witches let out their breath in a hiss of triumph. Again, slowly the boy held out his hand while Spook tried to withhold his heat, to bank his fire. But again Jamie's hand fell back, and again the witches hissed their triumph. Jamie pulled the cord of his bathrobe tight around him and tried for the third time to touch the glowing coal. He stretched his arm out its full length. The tips of his fingers turned scarlet from its nearness, but in the end he drew back his hand as before, and the witches jeered gleefully. Then the head witch called, "A stone for Grimalda! Give Grimalda a stone! Her power has prevailed! Proceed!" Grimilda was ready for him with a wave of her hands, and Spook was changing again. His fire was cooling. He felt something growing lighter, thinner, as though something was smothering him out and pressing him into flatness. He felt frail and rather brittle. "What am I now?" he wondered. "A piece of paper? No, I am more than that. A leaf." He lay upon the ground waiting for Jamie to pick him up. "Hurry," he whispered. "Hurry!" Grimalda was standing with her neck stretched out, her hands planted on her hips. She blew such a blast of air, it tumbled her hat forward on her face and sent Spook whirling, dizzyingly over Jamie's head. Jamie snatched at him, but he skimmed just before the boy's frantic reach. Then he drifted gently off towards the head witch and down, down, right into the black folds of her lap. There was a chorus of cackling laughter from the witches and then silence, as they watched to see what Jamie would do. Jamie ducked his head and gulped as he gazed at the terrible old lady above him. She sat perfectly still in the calm moonlight, the autumn leaf upon her lap. Slowly Jamie edged nearer. When he was close enough to reach the leaf with his fingertips, his hand came out from behind his back, and he stole towards Spook. "Hurry, hurry!" Spook urged him silently. Then Grimalda shoved her hat back on her forehead and blew another giant blast at Spook. He fluttered into the air and sailed again over Jamie's head, just out of reach, and came to rest in a whole pile of leaves that had drifted against the rocks. All about him he could hear them rustling and whispering dryly to one another. Hundreds of them, he was sure. How would Jamie ever know which one was the right one? Jamie, who had followed the flight of the leaf with his eyes, stood over the pile into which Spook had disappeared, a perplexed frown on his face. "If he tries to guess which leaf I am and misses, they won't give him another chance. Grimalda won the last point after he had 3 tries. This time he has tried twice and failed." Spook held himself alert for the slightest current of air that might blow him apart from the others, but none came, and still Jamie made no attempt to pick him out. What is he going to do? Worried Spook. He heard the head witch cry, 2 out of 3! 2 out of 3! Whoever wins this point gets the familiar. And the witches echoed, 2 out of 3! 2 out of 3! Suddenly, Jamie turned and walked a little distance away. Then he swung around and came hurtling back, and threw himself into the pile of leaves. He rolled over and over in them. Sitting up, he grabbed a great armful of them, and threw them into the air. Autumn leaves came floating down all around him, in his hair, on his eyes, onto his shoulders, and in his lap sat Spook, a solid little black dog once more. "That does it!" shrieked the head witch. "That gives the familiar to the boy." "No, no!" cried Grimilda. "Yes, yes," corrected the head witch. 2 points out of 3. You heard the rules." Jamie sat on where he was and hugged Spook, who snuggled blissfully against him. "You have lost the contest, Grimilda," said the head witch, "but you mustn't be downcast. There is a second prize." She reached into her wide sleeves, her wrinkled lips smiling mysteriously. "And here it is," she announced out of the deep black folds as she pulled. A tiny black kitten. "Take it," she said. "This is a proper familiar, and as it is the only young one, perhaps you will find a spell against sneezing to put on it before next Halloween." Grimilda started to reply, but then her nose began to twitch, and she clapped her hand over her face and said, snatching up the little cat, which spat ill-naturedly at her, she hurried to her broom. They heard one last "Away!" as the broom took flight and disappeared over the lonely hillside. "And now," said the head witch, "and now—" Jamie stood up with Spook beside him. The head witch rose from her seat and moved towards them, closer and still closer. Her eyes flashed in their deep sockets, and 2 red flames flared in them. A wind began to blow loud in Spook's ears. His head reeled, and he blinked hard to keep his eyes on hers. Darkness fell all about them, blotting out the witches and their cave and the light from the moon. Only the twin flames from the head witch's eyes glowed on. But after a while, they flickered and slowly dwindled away. Spook blinked again to find them in the distance, and then he opened his eyes. The darkness was gone. He was standing beside Jamie in the quiet kitchen they had left such a long time ago. The clock ticked on the shelf, and there was still a lingering smell of gingerbread on the air. The kitchen door flew open, and Mr. Brugle burst through, with the children crowding behind them. "Jamie!" he cried. "He's here!" sighed Evelyn. "Where's he been?" demanded John. "He's got the little dog with him," said Susan. Jamie took a step towards them. "Yes," he said, "I have the little dog, and now he's mine. His name is Spook." Spook thought of something he would like to say, but he remembered that they wouldn't understand him. And then he remembered something else. He looked quickly behind him, just as he thought. His tail had begun to wag again, slowly at first, and then faster, 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 as though it would never stop. And that's Spook. I hope you enjoyed Spook. I had fun reading it with you. As I said, my mother used to read this story to me every year when I was a child leading up to Halloween, about 1 chapter a night, until, we were a little bit too old for it. The book got misplaced, we found it again, whatnot like that. Even my older brother would sit and listen to it, even though he was a number of years older than me. It's a wonderful little book. I'm not too sure what Jane Little, what else she may have done, but this book is a treasure for me. If I had children, I would definitely read it to them every year. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care, and happy Halloween.